I'm pretty excited about this portion of the day. We're going to have a roundtable to talk about the CNC history, more generally speaking, but we're going to start first with Christopher Clarke, who's going to give a about 15-minute lecture on the history of West Bristol. So if you want to start us off.
All right. And since you all have been looking that way all day, I'm going to stand over here so that your necks get readjusted. I am not an archaeologist, I confess. I'm a historian. I had a career working in and for museums, did a bit of college teaching, but mostly did that. And most of what I did in museums was to tell stories with objects. There's a bit of irony there because that came after the work that I did here in West Bristol, and I don't know much about objects in West Bristol. But I can give you, I hope, a contextual idea about the history of what I call West Bristol, especially as it pertains to agriculture. My version of West Bristol is slightly larger than the one we've been talking about here. It includes Frost Town, but also Wilcox, which is just to the south, right? And those were two adjoining school districts, but they're also on the same road, and the people in those two communities had quite a bit of contact with each other. I first came to this area in 1979 in the fall to be a student in the PhD program at the University of Rochester. In the summer of 1980, I was sniffing around for a summer job, went to the RMSC and met Charles Hayes, who was then the director of research. And he said, would you be interested in doing some research on the area where the Cumming Nature Center is? I said, I volunteer. Oh, in that time period, the early 1980s, I worked to develop a historical portrait of the people and the communities that once occupied the landscape in the area that we call West Bristol. This area includes and surrounds the land that now belongs to Cumming Nature Center. And it was once the site of two robust, interconnected, and thriving farm communities. One called Frost Town, about which you've heard a great deal. The other located just to the south of Frost Town, called Wilcox. What I learned from my research was that from the early to mid-1800s until the mid-1920s, the people who lived in these West Bristol communities, a total population that grew to average in the range of 100 to 125, but actually peaked around 1880 at nearly 200 people. Hard to tell that from looking around today, isn't it? 200 people maintained an intensive relationship to their immediate environment and with their fellow community members, and drew their living from the surrounding natural resources. They grew field crops, wheat, barley, potatoes, corn, hops, beans, and hay, among others. They raised sheep and horses. They continued the harvesting of forest products from the area because even though much of the timber had been cut down, much was still left, and people could still cut up shingles and haul logs out for sale in the surrounding region. They also raised families and watched as one generation gave way to the next. For the context, or for some context for today's discussion, let me offer you a brief interview of the life cycle of farming in this area. Chapter 1. Some enterprising folks, we heard about the pioneers earlier, they were pioneers in this area, but they were enterprising folks, came here and began to cut timber and also cut roads across ridges that would give them access to the timber in this area. This is as early as the 1790s, continuing on into the early 1800s. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, once some of that land had been cleared, right? You take the trees down, you've still got stumps, but if you pull the stumps, you have what is known as new ground, right? Hasn't been farmed before. Good for agriculture. People in this area began to farm some of the land that had been cleared. This is going on in the 1830s and 40s, right? The early population that came through here was largely transient. They did not stay a long time. But as logging gave way to farming, by the mid-1800s, the population became more stable and turned over less frequently. This is how communities emerge and are constructed. So it's the middle 1800s. People are farming the land and starting to stick around. You can see it in these census records, right? At one point you see new names each time, and after a while you begin to see the same names over and over again. It's the middle 1800s. West Bristol communities are expanding along with the rest of New York State agriculture as a whole until the early 1880s, when a major downturn or depression hits the agricultural sector in New York State. This depression happened to coincide with what social historians refer to as a demographic crisis within many of these communities, meaning that the population had become too large for the community, right? And that's especially a problem when you go from one generation to the next, right? I'm a farmer, I have 6 children. I cannot divide my farm 6 ways. Very often the farm goes to the eldest male, and everybody else is on their own, and they're gone because what's left for them in this area? The population of this area between 1880 and 1900 declined by 40%. But interestingly, the communities then stabilized at that new level of about 125 residents in combined Frost Town and Gulick. And I was interested, somebody talked this morning about childhood memory making. And believe me, there's a lot of childhood memory making that was going on here in the second half of the 19th century. And we actually were able to catch hold of some of that because some of the people that we were able to interview when I was doing this work back in the 1980s were themselves 80, 85 and had been born at the turn of the century and had vivid memories of what this community was like early on in the 1900s. After the year 1900, when the community had restabilized, local people demonstrated renewed confidence and commitment to the area, especially around Gulick, just to the south. In 1900, the people in Gulick built a brand new Methodist Episcopal church in Gulick. There's a sign of confidence in the future. Somebody down there built what they referred to as a hotel, or probably, I guess they call it a hotel, but in any case, it was actually a place where people could stick around. There was a place you could get something to eat, etc. That's also a sign of a stable community. And last but not least, believe it or not, people in Gulick around the year 1900 created their own independent telephone company. And for the better part of 20 years, they operated a line of 10, 12 telephones in and around the community. Finally, they sold to the Rochester company in the 1920s. But those are all signs that people were invested in these communities and planned to stick around. There's an irony about these communities, right? People are, by the time of 1900, people are both pushed and pulled by technology of communication and transportation, right? I want phones so I can talk to the outside world. I want a car so I can go back and forth. And that's great. But the source of strength of my community is the fact that we're somewhat isolated and somewhat brought together by the geography of our surroundings. So there's a tension between preserving your community and wanting to connect to the rest of the modern world. The year 1919 was not a great year for farmers in general or for the people in West Bristol. During the First World War, the government of the United States bought enormous quantities of agricultural products to ship to Europe to feed lots of people who were not able to eat otherwise. Prices went up and everybody could sell everything they made. In 1919, the war is over. The government says, thank you very much, but we're not interested in buying your produce anymore. Agriculture prices plummet by as much as 50 or 60%, right? And if you're working on the margins and the price for the crop that you can sell goes down by that much, you are in big trouble. And that is precisely what happened to the people in this region. They simply were not able to do all of the things that other farmers were doing, right? Increased capacity, capital inputs, tractors, all that stuff that goes into what we call modern farming. couldn't do that here. And very quickly, people decided or admitted that they weren't going to be able to make a living here anymore as farmers. There were some other contributing factors. Soil exhaustion, right? People were not really rotating crops. They sometimes changed around, but there was no official cycle of crop rotation. People were restless in small communities. They felt isolated. They were curious and interested to see what was going on in the rest of the world. So the sixth and the last chapter of agriculture in this area is by the mid-1920s, people are leaving. Some people have already left. By the end of the 1920s, most people are gone. And it's kind of shocking to think that you could have a community of 100, 125 people, and 10, 15 years later, you're down to a couple of isolated households or a handful of people, and land is being sold off, and your community is gone. I'm going to talk just a little bit about evidence. How are we doing on time?
We're about 10 minutes in.
10 minutes in, okay, great. How do we know any of this about the community that was here? If you walk around today, you don't see much that says, wow, there were 200 people living here farming 100 years ago. There are multiple ways of knowing and discovering the past, including archaeology and the analysis of material evidence that we are discussing today, and this is one of the many reasons why we should welcome the work that Professor Smith and his colleagues are doing and their interest in this area, because they are expanding the picture of what we know. But if you say, how do we know about the past here? I'm just going to run down a list for you. We have state and federal census records. We have local tax records, although they're much better organized now than they were in 1980. In 1980, I went to the Ontario County Courthouse looking for tax records from this area. And I met Francis Finnick, who was a lovely guy who spent most of his time, as far as I could tell, out on the golf course. Anyway, in the best tradition of local public servants. He said, oh, the key to the basement's around here somewhere. He said, downstairs, you go down, see what you can find. And all of the tax records for the last 100 years, right, were in this giant room, you know, with screened metal grated fence-like stuff on it. And I went and just started rooting around. There is now, the good news, an Ontario County archive that's really quite well managed and organized, and if you want to find tax records today, they can put their fingers on them for you right away. We have maps. We have contemporary local newspapers. Somebody showed a newspaper from Naples, right? I looked at some of the Naples papers as well around the 1900s. Very helpful. We have the daybooks and diaries that farmers wrote and left. I was able to collect quite a number of those from one of the residents that I interviewed. And they are full of really important and helpful information. We have photographs, some of which you've seen in the exhibition that Dr. Smith and his colleagues have done. We have interviews with people who once lived here. Now, we don't have those anymore, unfortunately, but we do have them from the time period of the 1980s, right? I interviewed Gordon Proper in 1980. He was 80, I was 26, I think, at the time. He seemed really old to me. Doesn't seem quite as old now. And we have the careful excavation and analysis of material evidence, which is what we're talking about today. Using all of those resources, we can put together a pretty complete picture of how this community worked, who was in it, who left, what they did, right? And I will leave you with three quick, very important ideas about what we know about these communities. The first is that the way of life in this community in the mid-1800s was much more like the colonial farm communities in New England than it was about emerging corn farming in the Midwest or whatever. It was very backward looking. It was about a way of life that was quickly disappearing. But you'll notice that this landscape is actually rather similar to New England, right? And the same style of farming that was done there and sort of came with people here was done here. It involved community residents with strong bonds, labor exchange, right? An economy of barter rather than cash. I mean, it was really kind of an oldie-timey place. And the farmers who lived here have much more to do with the generations that were preceding them than the ones who came after. They were not modern farmers. Secondly, we know that people throughout the 19th and early 20th century earned a fairly decent living here. They were not rich, but they were prosperous enough. There was hierarchy in this community like any other, but people were in pretty good shape here. And they made a real living, and it was viable and possible to live and work here and feel like you were a part of what America was all about. Number 3, and finally, life was not easy, in quotation marks, for most of the people who lived here. They worked really hard. And in addition to that, they faced conflicts and struggles rooted in the issues that people in the 19th century dealt with, right? Economic inequality, racial issues, gender discrimination, that was all part of this community along with all of the good stuff. And I don't have time to tell you now the stories of some of the people here, but I can tell you that at one point while I was interviewing Gordon Proper, he said, well, now turn that machine off. I turned it off, and he told me a story about one of the workers he had who had hung himself in the woods because he was despondent, right? Just a story. There's also a story that was originally documented by Mary Shedlock about a woman who, as a young woman, was working in a different household and became pregnant, never let on who the father of her child was, delivered that child and gave that child up to her relatives to be raised. And that child also bore the stigma of being an illegitimate child. And this was going on within this community, right? And lots of great stuff about it, but there were still realities about this community that were no different from anywhere else in America in the 19th century. So I will conclude by saying it's important not to idealize the people who lived here, but it's also important to appreciate what they achieved and what they valued. To do this, it's important to know about their lives in as many different ways as possible. We want to use every resource at our disposal to explore and understand their lives, and that is one of many reasons to care about and value the work that Professor Smith and his colleagues and students are doing here, because they are adding to our picture and helping us better understand the communities and the people that once existed on this landscape. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That
My
was
pleasure.
Really cool. And if anybody, actually, I digitized some of Mary Shedlock's interviews.
Oh, great, yes.
So if anybody wants to listen to the people talking about Frost Town in the 70s and 80s, the phone booth in the exhibit, you can just press a button and somebody will start talking to you about it. So
Good stuff.
it's pretty cool. I'm going to get that proper ticket to me again at some point.
Okay, sure.
This sort of next part of this session is really dedicated to some of the people who have been involved with Frost Town and the CNC for a long time, or who are related to the people who once lived in Frost Town. Mm-hmm. So we just heard from Christopher Clarke, and you have a lot of experience studying the early days of the Cumming Nature Center. And we have Shariee Edersheim right here, who has been working with the Nature Center for a while. Forever? Okay.
Good for you.
Rory Stave on my left right here has got lots of really interesting stories about the Nature Center itself. And Ron Goodman on the left, who is a descendant of Isaac Wilcox. So very exciting to sort of hear your stories about the Nature Center. And I guess I probably want to start off maybe with Shariee.
Okay.
And talk about when you first got to the Nature Center, and what was it like when you first got here?
Oh boy, that was 1981, December. And in 1982, I started working as an interpreter, environmental education interpreter. And the boss at that time was looking for somebody for maple sugaring. So that sort of led from one position to another. It was a wonderful, exciting time. Environmental education was brand new, and the teachers didn't know how to teach it. So that was our job, to teach environmental education, not just to the students, but show the teachers how to teach it, what the words meant, why they were important, the order of the words. It was a big responsibility, but it was so much fun. The kids were just really into it. You know, at that time, we didn't have the internet, so we winged it. This is what we did. There was a broad network of other nature centers who were sort of in the same boat that we were. And Pennsylvania had a real good program, and we went there got a lot of ideas from them. We did environmental education programs, but we also had quite a big pioneer program as well, and that was really popular. The first 2 years I actually worked in the cabin doing pioneer stuff. And believe me, it was no picnic. One time we had a pioneer day. In my job, I was doing open hearth cooking. And I mean cooking, I don't mean just showing it. We were making pies and cakes and cornmeal, and it got so smoky, I ran out saying, "You people cook your own food, I'm through." Because it was so smoky in there. As a matter of fact, consumption, a form of TB, was one of the major causes of illness from all that smoking in the cabin. So it was an exciting time. We had different programs, different ideas. In 1973, Howard and Martha Cumming donated 925 acres. And supposedly, and don't turn me into motor mouth, okay?
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
They had trouble getting people to accept the property, and finally the museum did. And the first 2 years was spent deciding what they were going to do with the Nature Center and how we were going to progress with it. The bylaws of the Nature Center states we must maintain it as a natural area. We don't do four-wheelers, we don't do mountain bikes, we don't do horse riding. Your transportation is your feet, okay, or your knees or your hands or whatever. And we have maintained that throughout the 50 years that we've been here. And that's coming up, the 50-year anniversary is coming up. In the beginning, as I said, we pretty much winged it. Teachers were very grateful. Programs were written based on New York State syllabus. What I have found is the teachers have done a great job. Because we taught things like producers and consumers and decomposers. And this was, my grandson is a freshman in college now, but when he was in the 3rd grade, I had him on a hike and he was talking about decomposers. And I said, "Lord, boy, where did you learn that from?" And he said, "My teacher." So they've done a great, great job. It was so much fun working. We had quite an eclectic group here, okay? And we all sort of complemented each other. We worked together. We had a wonderful artist. Jerry Check was our ecologist. Ron Walker was our biologist. Martha, forget Martha's last, was our historian. Carl Bunberg was our forester, and I sat at their feet, and I learned, and I learned, and I learned. And it was exciting.
It's wonderful, yeah. In kind of along the same lines, Rory, I actually don't know when you came on board at the Nature Center, but a similar question for you. When did you come, and what were your first impressions?
So I came here with my parents at the end of the 80s, 88, 89. Went to FLCC to get my degree in natural resource conservation and interned here in 93 and 94. So that was my start back then. I actually helped to build the Wilderness Trail. That was one of my first projects in 93. After that, I went to school to get my degree in forestry and then came back to help out in 2000, and then I've been here since December of 2014. I did leave briefly, and now I'm back. I am back. So that's that's when I started. A couple interesting forestry things, because that's where I'm at. If you go to the top of the hill where the Wilderness Trail is, there's a fire road up there. And that was put in the late 60s because of 2 forest fires that were up there. And if you look at the trees as you walk around up there, you'll find that most of the trees over 20 inches in diameter are hollow in the middle. And that is from all the the two forest fires that they had. There's a lot of oak up there, and that does really well after a fire. So just by looking around, you can see those things. Other things that you can see that you may not understand that are out there, the pines. I'm not sure if you've been out here, but if you look down the pines, it's in basically a rectangle. And between the pines and the pond that's just out here where you can see out the window, there's a stone wall. But you have to look for it. It's there. But that's the reason why the pines are there and not everywhere else. Another stone wall that we have is, as you're driving in and out, there's an island between the driveways. It kind of opens up. If you look at it, there's actually a stone wall right there, and there's very large trees. And if you look really close, you can see the wire fencing running through that. That line actually extends all the way down through one of our camps, all the way down to the creek. But you can follow those lines through the woods, and it's quite interesting on how the property's all broken up by these dilapidated stone walls, but you just have to look for them. If you go to a website, Ontario Encore, it's Ontario's tax mapping, and anybody can get on it. You can look at any property in Ontario. You can actually dial back. They have multiple maps on there, satellite photos, and you can dial them back. If you look at the 2018, there's no leaf cover, and if you go over to Frost Town Road, you can actually follow Frost Town, which cuts across our property, the original road that goes from Frost Town Road over to West Gulick Road. You can actually follow it across our property, the two wheel tracks from the wagons that runs across.
Yeah.
So all those things that when you're out there looking and hiking and learning about the woods, you can actually find. You don't have to be an archaeologist to do it.
But it does help. And I'll be talking a little bit about that later, and that's sort of like understanding how the forest works around ruins, right? How you can actually see that shaping the natural landscape, even though people haven't been inhabiting those things for years. So that's fantastic. And I got lots of pioneer cabin questions for you guys, but before we go too far down that road, I was hoping, Ron, you could talk a little bit about your family and sort of how you relate to the Wilcox family. And for anybody who hasn't seen the exhibit yet, the Wilcox family had a house just north of the Nature Center, and they were there for almost the entire time that we have good maps of this region. So, yeah.
Okay. I'm the great-great-grandson of Isaac Wilcox. He came here with his family from Rhode Island. His father's name was Harvey G. They first came to Utica before they moved to South Bristol. They moved to South Bristol between 1835 and 1840 by the births of the children. I have never been able to find any records, only one, where he bought property, and that was for an acre he bought in lot 48, where on the map it shows as J.L. Wilcox. That would be James Leonard. That would be his oldest son. My grandfather, his son, his first property purchase was in 1849, which was the bottom half of lot 48. He bought it from a Walter Hubble. I just got this information, so I really haven't dug into it. I don't know where Walter Hubble is or where he was from or where he lived.
That's news to me too.
And his second purchase was basically the top half of lot 48, and he bought that from a James Parmalee. I never knew he was in the sawmill business. All his obituary, anything I've ever found about the guy was that he was a very successful farmer. And I'm looking at land transfers. He bought and sold a lot of land in the area for profit, I'm assuming. His oldest child, my great-grandmother, she was given a diary by her daughter, my grandmother, in 1939, I believe it was, which happened to be the last year that she lived. And when I got to her birthday, which was in June, she says, a little entry in there, she says, I was born in South Bristol, New York, in a log cabin. Well, she was born in 1858, and on the 1859 map, it shows Isaac living on the east or the west side of the road. And I always assumed that log cabin was there. but that does not mean anything. She could have been born in her neighbor's house or some other house. So, unfortunately, my grandmother, when I was 16 years old, she left me a trunk. And in this trunk were a lot of wedding gowns, baby dresses, and pictures of the Wilcox family. Being a stupid kid at 16, I'm thinking, oh, great. I've always kept that trunk, though, and used it as a stand until I got interested in genealogy, and then I couldn't believe the treasures that were in there. The old wedding gowns, etc., and the pictures which were given to Alex. The only reference I've ever had that Isaac had a sawmill, I found an article, 1880-something, that a guy from Bristol went up and wanted some wood cut. And he offered to help, and in the process of helping, he cut off 3 fingers. That's the only reference I've ever had that Isaac Wilcox owned a lumber mill. His daughter, my great-grandmother, she lost 2 husbands. The second husband was my great-grandfather. Had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. The boy, he died at an early age. He owned Ace's Restaurant in Honeyland. They made it into a grocery store back then. And she couldn't support 3 kids, so she kept the 2 girls, and she had a grandson, which Isaac raised. And Isaac eventually gave him property on the west side of the lake, west side of the road. And late in the 1890s, the house burned. And the article says, the dwelling of Dana Wood, which was his name, burned, lost all furniture and 800 bushels of potatoes. And I'll tell you, it's got to be a misprint. And then I found another article, another newspaper, of course they probably copied each other, and it says 800 bushels of potatoes. When Isaac stopped farming, he and his wife moved to Naples, and he moved across the road, I should say. He went down the east side. He sold that property to Dana, his grandson. The barn burned. And Isaac, when they moved to Naples, he only lived 3 months before he died. His wife died shortly thereafter. And 3 years after she died, I found a land transfer in the records that the estate of his grandmother foreclosed on Dana.
Oh, really?
It made him believe. He moved down she married a Briggs Gull at the base of Honeoye. That's where she was raised. Before that, he had another house fire. So I don't know if this guy's professional artist, I don't know. I barely remember the guy. He was a big grape farmer at the south end of Honeoye Lake on the east side. But that's basically what I have.
Oh, that's great. There's a lot of fires, apparently. Your experiences with the cooking are really, you know.
Fortunately, he was fully insured, it said. So.
What was that?
Can I ask a question about all these fires? Is that like a
that's what I said. The first it said he was fully insured. He lost his furniture, lost potatoes. That was pretty critical.
It sounds like the house is made of potatoes. That's a lot of potatoes.
Either that or just bad luck, I guess. I don't know. I don't understand the foreclosure though by his grandmother. I don't know why that came about. He must have did something to her that didn't set right.
What decade was that? During what?
Pardon?
Which decades was that? Was that during
Which what?
what year?
decade?
What year?
What years? What did it burn?
Yeah.
The first one burned, I think it was 1890s on the west side. The east side was like 1904, early 1900s.
So they didn't have electricity yet, huh? And they were using
probably
maybe
not.
oil lamps or
Probably.
something. Yeah.
Probably, sure.
And there is actually there's a history of forest fires in this area.
Sure.
Too. So every once in a while there is a forest fire that happens. We haven't had one in a while, I guess, since the 60s, I suppose, at this point. But that is something that may have not made it into the record as much, especially if it was smaller.
There was 2 bad. One was in 58. I remember that one,
Yeah.
down that area, and then the one in 63.
63.
Yeah, 2 bad fires.
Yeah. And that's really fascinating for a number of reasons, but I won't go down the forest fire route. From an archaeological perspective, that would wipe out the rest of the houses, and we have a lot of burned materials from houses, which actually makes sense. But I was going to ask you a follow-up. If the Nature Center itself, if you come to the Nature Center a lot, or if you have a lot of experiences here, like walking around the area. It wasn't quite the Wilcox family farm or anything like that, but yeah, I don't know what experiences you have at the CNC.
No, I don't.
Do you know there's a headstone, a Wilcox headstone in the cemetery?
There's a what?
Oh, Wilcox headstone
Yeah.
in the cemetery.
He's buried in Rose Ridge. Isaac is buried in Rose Ridge
Well,
Cemetery.
I don't know. There's one buried in the cemetery.
Oh, there could be.
across from
There was
it.
a ton of
I
Wilcoxes
don't
in
know.
South Bristol.
There was a cemetery there, and the
Yeah.
bodies were eventually moved, and one of them, I think, was a Wilcox.
Yeah,
Yep,
no, there's
yep.
still a
I think
headstone.
it was Isaac who was moved.
Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the headstone is still out there. So, and a divot where the grave was,
Yeah,
which is really weird. Very exciting. But yeah, and so it's interesting because the early days of the Nature Center were very much sort of oriented around like reconstruction and things along those lines, especially with the pioneer cabin and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering, Christopher, like you guys did a lot of research with like Gordon Proper and the descendants of the Macumbers, Mary Shedlock was her
Sure.
name. Did you guys have any sort of symposium or anything like that back in the day?
No, we did not have a public forum. I published an article in a newsletter that's printed by the New York State Museum, and actually there are some copies of that down here. You're all welcome to have one if you like. It's basically a summary of the history of this area. And about a decade later, I worked up a talk that summarized much of my research and put it into a bit of a larger context. And there's a program called Speakers in the Humanities by the New York State Council on the Humanities. And I gave that talk maybe 20, 30 times over the period of 10 years during the 1990s. But there was no symposium, public presentation of the information that we did.
Yeah.
But speaking of public presentation of information, my hope is that someday here on the Cumming Nature Center property, there will be some interpretive signage that talks about the history of the people who lived in this area. Not to overshadow the natural history, but to complement it, because human history here is a very important part of what shaped the landscape. And if you didn't know about that, you might assume that either it had always been wild, or that people were never here or whatever. And I think it'd be a great way to make our understanding of the area more complete if we could put some signage up about the history of humans in this area.
Yeah, and there were a lot of people around here.
Yeah,
and there's
it's
a lot of evidence of people themselves.
Yeah.
And I should mention too, if anybody like feels like they have a question or something that's really burning in their mind, just raise your hand or yell a little bit. That's fine too.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have another question.
Please.
You talked about the logging in the early part, first in the early part of the 19th century.
Correct.
Was this after land grants, and treaty?
Yes,
that
I mean, this is...
the land was allotted to settlers or people coming
Right.
in?
I mean, some of it was given away. Revolutionary War soldiers got grants of land in central and western New York. Other parts of it were opened up or sold. But this was the first work by European settlers or Europeans coming into the area to take possession of and control of the landscape.
Is that the Gorham Purchase too?
Well, that was a little earlier, but same idea. Yeah.
See,
could
Camille
I-
Wilder was very influential in this area here, on the Nature Center itself. He had a sawmill here, Frost Town. He hired the people, but he didn't pay them money. He gave them property instead of paying them money. So he had a sawmill that he would float the logs down Briggs Gully into Honeoye Lake. And we can still see some of the sluice there. There was a little road that the oxen would pull because they didn't have horses, they had oxen, would pull or push the logs down into the Briggs Gully. So he was very instrumental in this whole area here.
I ask about that logging too because I'm an oral historian and I interviewed Marion Miller, who lived in Avon, but she originally came from the Oil Springs area, the family native Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, and she talked about her family logging, participating in some of that logging earlier on. Yeah, so this kind of fits in, you know, with
Yeah.
that history.
And well, that's what he did. He cut the trees and he logged them out and sent them. And actually, they sent the ash to Europe to use as fertilizer because the land here was so fertile when they first moved here. They didn't need to fertilize the land. So the ash that they used from burning some of the trees was sent over to Europe to be used as fertilizer.
Was it shipped up to the Erie Canal?
It was shipped down to Honeoye Lake, and then from Honeoye Lake, it was up to the St. Lawrence River area.
I see.
And
Okay.
then out, yeah.
Thank you.
As
Thank
far
you.
as we know. We had a historian, when I first started working here, we had a historian who was very instrumental in our pioneer program. We showed a 1790 time period and was very instrumental in making sure we followed the 1790 protocol, if that's what you want to call it. And we did pioneer stuff the way the pioneer, and it was not an easy life. We tended to romanticize that period, but it was not an easy. I was told the #1 cause of death in women was suicide because little
Wow.
Johnny would disappear and you'd never see little Johnny again, you know. So it was a hard life, you know. As I say, consumption was very rampant at times, and the kids would get a cold or they would just get really sick, no doctors. They had some medicinal herbs and whatnot that they used, but there were no doctors around in the area. And also the Native Americans really helped them out a lot as well, the ones that remained here.
Is this close to Corn Planters Track, or how far away?
Yeah, I don't know yet. But they came in January and February over the frozen streams and on the snow with a sled and oxen. And they came from Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, other areas. Like he said, the Civil War, the American Revolution soldiers saw all this land out here and saw how fertile it was. And that's how this area here, the Nature Center property. That's why we have so many little homesteads around the property. Is that Camille Lava gave these people land instead of.
I can imagine it would have been rough on the horses and the carts going up and down.
Well, and you know what? The oxen, they didn't have to bother about feeding the horses because they didn't have the hay, but the oxen would roam the fields and the woods eating leaves and acorns and stuff like that. That's why they had the oxen.
And this is an interesting part of this too, in terms of the CNC's history.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize, or maybe you do, I don't know, that early CNC or Cumming Nature Center, there was like these real strong attempts to make like historical recreation. So like the Pioneer Cabin, the Sugar House, those were all part of a plan to make this not Genesee Country Village and Museum, but similar in origin to that. And you've had a lot of experience working on the Sugar Shack and recreating that. Do you want to talk about the like ways in which they made the? Because Dave was probably going to talk about that.
Yeah. So back in '83, they had somebody come out and put on a log cabin building class, and that's how the Sugar House got built. So if you hike over there, it's actually down in a depression and in the landscape, and it was done that way on purpose. It's a large building, so getting logs to it was easier. They didn't use many mechanical things to do it. They did it all by hands. Once the walls were put up, and they're fairly short. If you walk in and you're 6'4", you're going to hit your head on the doorway. But to get the roof up, the roof is a 12-12 pitch, so it's quite tall. I think the building stands almost 20 feet in the air at its peak. And to get all those logs up there, they actually rolled them down the hill and up ramps that they built on the walls to then put the logs on the far side, and then they worked their way back over. It was all done by hand. They didn't use any tractors. They did have oxen at the time, which is kind of crazy back in 1983. But
Did you meet the oxen?
yeah, Duke and Dan were here.
Oh.
Those were the names of the oxen. And Dave, who's been here since 1978, was actually that team lead on those and would drive the oxen if needed. All those logs were then rolled into place and put up. Nowadays, if we wanted to build a cabin, we can build it anywhere. We'll bring in a crane, lift the logs, and do what we need. But it is specifically located in that area so that everything could be done by hands. The Pioneer Cabin, which Shariee was in,
Yeah.
was built by one of the teachers from FLCC. He is thus retired. He was the coach of the Woodsman's team there, and that entire cabin was put together by hand by him and one other person. They
Using
were
the tools that the pioneers
Yeah.
would have used. The
Right,
draw
so-
knife, the probe, the schnitzel box shaving horse.
Yep.
That's why it looks so authentic.
Yeah, it was done just like they would have done, hewing axes and everything out of green poplar was the logs that are up there. So it's all fitted by hand.
Supposedly, when they put that cabin up, it would be solid. And then they would cut the door and they would cut a window. Some of them would have two windows, but the basic one was just that one small door and then that one window. There's a story that some of them would have like a door in the back of the cabin. And in the wintertime, they would bring the milk cow in to milk it because it was too cold. And they'd send them out the back door. So I'm not sure. I think some of this stuff we made up. One of them that I'm sure, you guys know what a hawthorn tree is?
Yes.
With those very sharp needles, very, very painful. I got them go through my boots. Well, supposedly the women would use these hawthorn needles to hold their clothes together because they didn't bring many buttons. Now, and there's a chemical on the end of those thorns that will really hurt you. Would you pick your baby up with that thorn on you? I wouldn't.
Yeah, the Frost Town team knows hawthorn intimately well.
Yes, I bet they do.
This hall site is completely surrounded by like seemingly an orchard of hawthorn.
Yeah. Once a hawthorn, it'll stay a hawthorn until you cut him down.
Yeah, wow, and they'll stab you in the head.
Yeah, they will.
Yeah.
They will. Yeah.
So yeah,
Can I just say a couple of things about the history of women in this area?
sure. Yeah.
We talk a lot about farming and this and that and people cutting down trees, and it gives you a sense that most of the work was done by men, or at least the visible work, right? It's really important to keep in mind that women were doing a huge amount of invisible labor that to us is invisible, but also to recall that they were a really important part of the farm labor force.
Yeah.
Young women, girls and younger women who were not married, were part of a sort of mobile labor force, and we have several accounts of the fact that during the harvesting season, the wagon would come around and pick up all the young women in the area, and they would go to one farm and then another. They picked hops, they picked berries, right? Anything you could pull out of the ground, doing potatoes, right? And that is all something that kind of gets lost in the story of, people coming and subduing the landscape and farming. And one other thing, if you read the day books that the farmers left behind, right? In the summer they're, plowing and doing this and cutting stuff, and then in the winter there's this long period where they write stuff like, didn't do much today, right? Now, in fact, they were doing something, right? They were filing their saws, but they were not, but there was a seasonal rhythm to their work. But if you think about the women in these communities, there was no seasonal difference in the work they did. They had every day to put food on the table, take care of the kids, et cetera, and that's a really important story that sometimes gets lost in the history of talking about who lived here and what their lives were like. Women were critically important to what they did, and they worked very, very hard.
Because open hearth cooking was no fun.
That's
It
right.
took a lot of time and effort and monitoring and little Johnny's running under, and they didn't have some of the older places had the babysitter poles where they tied the kid to the pole. I'm serious. But like an older kid would look after the younger ones. But man, after working in that cabin for 2 summers, he's right. The women, from daylight to dark, man, it was just one thing. The clothes, the mending, the chinking, keeping the cabin warm, keeping your family fed, was always, as a mother, in the back of your mind, keeping your family safe. I would have been a wreck.
Did you want to say?
I have a diary dated 1880 from another of my great-grandmothers. Her husband was a farmer on Canadice. And this diary, every day was an entry. And she went through what she did for that day. I was exhausted reading it.
Yeah.
What she did all day, it was just her. And I think, holy God, she was help George today do this and that. That's your husband. then all the housework and stuff. Holy cow!
Ron, I would come in from the building after working in the cabin, and people would go, "Why do I smell smoke?" I smell smoke. I said, "Oh, that's me."
Yeah.
And it's if you all go into the exhibit, if you look at any picture of agricultural work in the exhibit, it's always men and women. It's never just men. And in fact, there's often more women than men. Which you guys are making that very clear to me right now. Why that's the case. I thought that was very interesting.
Because sometimes the men would go off for a couple of days, and the women would be at home taking care of the homestead.
Yeah, there's a great image in there that actually I got from you, berry picking. I think it's the Dyer Hatch family, or
There's the sort of one guy sitting in the
one
middle,
guy.
and he's surrounded by all these women with baskets who are going to go pick berries.
It's fascinating. So I have one question for you, Ron. Is it strange to have an exhibit that's sort of related to your family?
I feel quite pleased that you did that.
Oh, great.
Really, I'm surprised. I thank you.
No problem.
I sent it to the rest of the family that are interested in genealogy. It's really cool. I feel really proud.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You said, or someone said that they really use like bartering as a means of like economy and stuff. Like, did money and did like money ever move into that?
I'll be happy to answer that. Yes, I mean, everybody, the money was here, but people did not use money as the most common form of exchange, right? It was mostly about mutual work, right? And all the farmers are saying, spend half a day digging potatoes here, help so-and-so plow, right? And they're writing that down not just because they want to know what they did, because they can keep that, and then they know that somebody else owes them half a day on their farm, right? Or they trade goods or whatever. But cash, since many of the people there were not earning a cash income on a regular basis, it makes sense that they wouldn't be using cash as an exchange medium. They were trading in favors and other ways that was just as valid and just as valuable. But cash entered into it mostly when they started going out to sell their products other places. And that's something that happens especially after 1900. The people who stay here in that last 20 years when the communities were thriving, they were making a lot more trips to Naples and Honeoye with loads of shingles, potatoes, you name it. And they were more connected to the marketplace then than they had been previously. And that's one reason that the agricultural depression was so devastating, because they were really dependent on that market now. But during most of the 19th century, people gave things back and forth to each other and kept careful records of it, but they were not giving each other, they were not paying each other with money, mostly. The one exception is that some of the young girls who worked would get a couple of cents or something for an afternoon of picking, right, or something like that. But that was really more pocket money than an actual wage of any kind.
Maple sugar also played a very important part of that barter, because the people came in January and February. They couldn't make their own maple sugar that year. So the new people coming in, I have 2 pounds of sugar that I would trade you for that pound.
So there was a trading post?
No, it was basically between neighbors, right? I mean, everybody knew everybody else. Lots of people worked on lots of other people's farms at one point, both men and women, but particularly men in this case, and they kept careful records of whom they worked for and who came to work for them. And in the end, they figured out a way to settle it up, usually with, I owe you for half a day's work, I'm going to give you, 2 bushels of potatoes, or this or that. But it was all about the commodities that they had in their possession.
Yeah, Anastasia.
I just had a question when you guys were talking about the photographs of everybody who was farming or working in the community, and that many of them were predominantly women. I'm thinking about those photographs. There's many photographs of hop pickers and the beer industry in the area, which I think a lot of us today don't really know about because we're known as the wine region. And I was wondering if anybody had any stories about beer at Frost Town.
Beer at Frost Town?
I don't know, but we do have some hops on the Pioneer Trail.
Oh, really?
Oh, really? were those planted?
Yeah.
They're
yeah,
left over
yeah.
from,
they're- yeah, they're
that's cool.
leftovers.
Interesting,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, so as you go out the Pioneer Trail, there's a bridge that's 16 feet long, and on either side they're hops.
No, so were those
Yeah.
planted in the 80s, or were they just left over? From
They were just
They're
left over from.
yeah.
Well, another reason why hops is no longer found all over the place is there was a blight that killed it off. And so that is another reason why you don't see it a lot around here. And when you go to grow it, you have to be careful that your plants can get it. So that's something.
And so we haven't even talked about clothes. Did they go naked?
While they were picking, growing up.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good way to do
Yeah.
it. But,
Yeah, especially when they're walking through the hawthorn bushes.
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
and I know that prohibition was very negative for hop
Yep.
growth around here as well too. So hop blight, prohibition, and this used to be a huge hop growing region, especially in Bristol. Learned that from you guys with that wonderful team. Yeah.
So when you describe the farming economy as being, and culture being more of a throwback to like 18th century New England rather than 19th century Midwest. So was the barter trade economy more of like a closed system, or were any goods sold out for cash or for other?
Much of it was closed within the community, but shipments of many products did go outside the community, and that did bring some cash back in. So it was not entirely barter, but the cash was more about crops that were moving out and into the community, and amongst the community members, the trade was largely barter. I mean, for every rule there are many exceptions, but that's the general nature of the way it worked.
And from a material culture perspective, like not a lot was locally made in terms of like ceramics and things like that. It was mostly mass-produced stuff that was imported too.
Yeah.
So almost every plate that we have is actually from England. It's not from the United States.
Sure.
And those frozen Charlotte dolls are all from Germany.
Yeah.
So.
See, initially the pioneers didn't, when they first moved here, didn't bring a lot. They had to bring stuff they could not make once they got here. And once they can make stuff out of wood, they didn't bring buckets, they didn't bring this. They made those things once they got here. And it was important. Like, I was serious about the clothes. The women would bring maybe just 3 or 4 buttons, or maybe they would have, God, I got, 3 closets full of clothes that I don't wear anymore. And they had maybe 2 skirts. That's why they had the garments that they had, the aprons, the top, the this, the that, and that was all made by teasing wool, carding it, and then using the spinning wheel to spin it, and then weaving it. So, don't you get that dirty?
Yeah.
Just to make a connection between Shariee, you talking about the clothing, and the wedding dresses that Ron, you mentioned, are those homemade wedding dresses?
The ones I have,
Yeah.
that's a good question. I don't know. I've asked my wife.
Just curious.
Now, there were some rich people,
They could've
Pitts,
been.
who built a house in Honeoye. He built that house before he moved his family here. So some of the richer people didn't have to live. I would have to live in that cabin the way the normal people did. Maybe a Rockefeller could have built everything already. So that could have been where the wedding dress came from. But I would have had to bring 1 skirt and 1 top.
I would have done that too. Yeah.
So I had a question. I wonder, don't be afraid if you happen to know it, but was there any kind of information or records that had any signs of encounters of any blacks coming up from the South, if it had any connection to the Underground Railroad, if possible?
In Honeywell. Honeywell was very famous for it. There were 2 houses there that they safe houses for the slaves.
So
The Pitts Mansion and the other one by the hardware in Honeywell. There was 2 of them. They were both owned by Pitts family, who one daughter married Douglas. So it was a big.
I can add that one of the stories that I heard was about a fellow named Irving Washburn who lived a bit north of Frost Town. He went to Honeoye because that was where he had to go to high school, right? if you lived in this area, you could either go to high school in Naples or Honeoye. He was closer to Honeoye. And there's a picture of his graduating class, and when there's in which there's one young African-American woman who was part of the graduating class of Honeoye High School in 1915, perhaps. So that's clear evidence of at least one African-American family living in this region, and surely there were more. But here in Frost Town proper, I'm not sure. I couldn't say for sure if we.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious because of the time period we were discussing.
Right.
The early 19th century.
Yep.
Early to mid 19th century, about the early 20th.
Right.
The town of like if Frost Town, particularly, as it's considered a ghost town today, if there's any particular kind of encountership, albeit temporarily or.
So I have found a record of one individual who lived near Frost Town who was a preacher. He was an itinerant preacher, and he was very old, and he was living on one of the properties, and he was described as African American man who lived on one of the northern properties. And this was in he died in a house fire, that's another fire. But he was quite old. I think he was around 90 or something along those lines. And this is the one piece of evidence I've found thus far, but this is actually something I've started to investigate, because in Bristol, if you go back to the 1850s or even a little bit further, you do see families in the census that are described as African American in the census records. So it actually seems like in the mid 19th century there was a bit of movement of people in this area. And then most of those people kind of moved to larger centers.
Right.
But yeah, that's a great question.
Yep.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I guess, yeah.
I was wondering, in Frosttown, for they focused on logging and agriculture, but did they have any records of animals? Someone mentioned wool, sheep or horses or any sort of animal
One of our
farms.
trails, the Green Trail, was heavily grazed by sheep. And that's why the landscape of that now was formed by the sheep grazing on that piece of the property. And sheep was important to them because that's how they got. Now later on, when they were able to plant, what they plant? Lindsay Woolsey? What's that? Linen. They could make Lindsay Woolsey. They would make a combination of the linen and the wool. But wool was their main source of clothing.
We have some photographs of farms in this area of sheep grazing on a knoll, looking down into places that are recognizable as in this area. And the Prober family down in Gulick were raising draft horses for some time in the mid to late 1800s. So animals were a very common part of the landscape here and of the experience of most of the families who lived here.
And they all had most of them had a milk cow, at least one milk cow.
Horses, milk cows, orchards, all
Yeah.
that fun stuff. Question?
One more, I don't want to go over the time here, but in terms of the photography in this area, where do you really see that shift of record keeping on paper and then photography? Do you see, glass plate, wet collodion, dry plate, or Kodak film? Where do you see that shift in the picture taking in this area, and how far back they go?
So okay. So the oldest photo I've seen is the daguerreotype that you shared with us.
Yeah, the oldest girl in that picture, that's my great grandmother. She was born in 1858. She looks to be about 10, maybe.
Okay,
in that
so
picture, she's even that. So it's
that technology kind of dies out by
Yeah.
the 1860s.
Yeah.
So it's super early.
It's a very expensive thing at that time, and being that this was a middle to low income area in terms of cash flow rather than, because obviously they were very rich in materials, which they used to trade amongst each other, and it also brought those to market to get some form of income. But photography in that time frame was very expensive.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see photographs that go back that far to show that somebody had the money to pay somebody who had the equipment to come and take those pictures.
Well, the Wilcoxes were actually pretty prosperous, weren't they?
he was.
Yeah.
Isaac was very
Yeah.
prosperous.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was well-to-do. Everything I've ever read about him, he always referred to him. He was a justice of the peace at one time, too.
Yeah.
In the end, he got dementia. And they took, and they wouldn't let him sign his name on anything anymore.
Well, at least it wasn't a house fire. So
I'm getting there now.
yeah, from the images I've seen, a lot of the families would go to Canandaigua to get their portraits taken, and I think maybe Naples, but I've seen more Canandaigua as a little bit more of a hub, and especially the late 19th century.
Yeah.
But what's interesting too is one research angle, which I was not expecting, is the real photograph postcards from the turn of the century. You see a lot of them, and we were sharing our mutual love of these.
Right.
They show these really mundane scenes, which you wouldn't expect to be on a postcard, but it's just a picture that was taken and then printed for the individuals to then send, and some of them were reused and things like that.
Yep.
But
And they can make copies of it. Sometimes you'll see 4 or 5 the same picture, but not a lot of them. That's why it's valuable.
And supposedly, when they had that flash that they had to hold up,
Yeah.
we have on the property stiff club moats are like a podium. And their seating body is called strobili. And those were collected, and they're about that big. Those were collected, and that's what they used to light that fire.
yeah, interesting.
That light,
Well, I'll ask one more question to Rory. Sorry. And this is a question for all of you guys to some extent, but I know that the Macomber house there was a house on the Cumming Nature Center property in the late 70s, early 80s, and you know a little bit about what happened to it. But I'm wondering if you guys know anything more about what happened to the property.
You don't remember what happened to the farmhouse across the street?
green one. Oh yeah. It was used as the control for firefighters.
Oh, really?
Yeah. No. When we first started, that was the building we used. It was a green farmhouse. And then a couple years later, they built a little green shack with
the parking lot is.
today.
Yeah.
And then this building was dedicated in 1982. But that green farmhouse, at one time we had quite an intern program. I had 6 interns at one time, and that's where they lived. And when we lost the fundings and everything, that was burned down. I didn't realize that was a Macomber house. I just thought it was an old green farmhouse.
It's one of the Macomber houses, yeah. We'd probably find a ton of trash in that backyard.
Speaking of houses here on the Nature Center property, it's interesting to me that you guys have been conducting digs at the Hall House site. If you listen to the interview that Mary Shedlock did, right? I mean, in theory, an infant was buried just outside that house, under a bush. It's just interesting. I mean, you're working.
Yes.
So it's entirely possible that you might come across.
Well, hopefully not.
So, as you're leaving today, as you're leaving the parking lot today, in that little island where you have to go around the driveway, right? It's there for a reason. Well, back in 1996, the tree, it just fell down this past week, was struck by lightning there. And if you go just beyond that, there's a spruce tree with a gravestone. Right there, and that's why that island is there.
I see.
Yeah.
We
We don't know if there's somebody
I wasn't aware of that.
buried there, but there is.
Yeah, no, David found that when
Yeah.
they were putting the parking lot in.
Yeah.
He found that, just that headstone.
Right.
That was the only history I know, that he just found it.
It's an early one too,
Yeah.
early Macomber. So
Okay.
I think it was I forget which Macomber. She's listed in the exhibit, but
It's
Rowena.
fun, it was fun.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
It was
Yeah.
fun.
But she died pretty early on, and that's probably before even the Frost Town Cemetery was even there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Super early on. So
Yeah, she was the first Mrs. Macomber, right?
Yes, first Mrs. Macomber.
Yep.
Followed by a very similarly named second Mrs.
Right.
Macomber. It's very confusing. But we've gone over a little bit here, but this was just so interesting I couldn't stop us.
Great.
But any last questions before we take a break?
Oh,
Yeah.
there was something about hops, right?
Yeah.
So, just off of our property, north of here, is the owner of Twisted Rail. And he was redoing his house a couple years ago, and found a beer recipe. And so if you go to Twisted Rail,
Oh, for heaven's sake,
you can
put it
actually
in the wall or
in
something?
the wall of the house.
Great.
And you can actually go and I believe it's called Farmhouse Ale.
It's a local brew.
It's a local brew. There's one in Canandaigua. There's one in Honeyway.
There's also a Frost Town beer
Yep.
associated with that too. Yeah.
Just quick, the house you're talking about belonged to the Gleasons. And
Right.
Alan told me his father made the 4 boys, you know how stony it is here, grow potatoes and berries. That's why every one of them became a professor. Alan Gleason told me that. You want to work hard. They grew potatoes and sold them in the market.
That's awesome.
Just one more thing, you know, the Nature Center is an awesome place. Come and visit. We have
Agreed.
hiking trails, we have activities going on, but mostly what we have is out there. And we have some amazing wildflowers, and we have one very rare that we're very proud of. It's called the spreading glow flower. There are only 30 sites in New York, and we are listed in the New York Heritage Society as the #1 place to come and see it. A couple of years ago, 2 professors from Cornell came down because they heard we had this spreading glow flower. The director, Nathan, and I took them out. We were coming back. I turned to Nathan and said, I didn't understand a word they were saying. And he said, neither did I. But we have some awesome wildflowers, not just the trees. And people come here and come in and say, I didn't see a thing out there. Don't be one of those people. The forest, the trees, the wildflowers are just there. I'm doing a wildflower hike next week. Come to it. It's amazing. It's just amazing the way these. Oh, okay, I shut up.
Well, thank you all for doing this, and thank you all for listening. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in a few minutes.
Yeah.
So, awesome. Make sure to grab one of these as well.
I'll just mention that this is a short article based on the research that I did on this area. There are many copies here. Please help yourself if you'd like one. They're right up here on the.
Yeah.